You're a king and you're 30 years old and today is your wedding day, a political alliance marriage between France and Austria, and diplomats arranged everything over 2 years of negotiations, and you've never seen the bride, just saw one portrait of her face. And now at the wedding ceremony you're waiting at the door and the door opens and you see your bride for the first time, and she's 7 years old, a child, tiny in a white wedding dress, her feet barely touching the ground. And you're shocked because you knew she was young but you didn't know she was 7. And protocol says the ceremony must continue. No waiting, the marriage must be completed today. And the little girl looks at you with frightened eyes and you realize that tonight in your bedroom this child will be there. And you don't know what you're supposed to do because she's your legal wife but also a child. Before we explore one of the most disturbing but historically common practices in European royal marriages, where political necessity created unions between adult men and girl children, if you're drawn to these stories that reveal how power and politics destroyed childhood and created impossible situations, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from, because understanding these historical practices helps us recognize how recently childhood has been protected and how marriage has meant vastly different things across time. You are King Richard II of England in 1396, 30 years old, and your first wife Anne of Bohemia died 2 years ago, leaving you without an heir, and your kingdom is weak, threatened by France, which has more land and more soldiers and more wealth, and your advisors explained that the only way to secure peace and prevent invasion is through a marriage alliance with France, and the French King Charles VI has offered his daughter Isabella, and when you asked how old she was, your chief diplomat avoided your eyes and said young, but the marriage can happen now, consummation can wait, and you understood what young meant, asked how young, and the diplomat answered she's 4 years old now, we'll wait until she's 7 for the marriage. And you thought this must be a joke, but the diplomat was serious. He explained that many royal marriages work this way. The girl child grows up in her husband's court, becomes accustomed, learns, and the king waits several years for consummation. And this is normal, this is common. And if you refuse, then France will be offended and the alliance won't happen and the kingdom will be in danger. And he listed other examples. Other kings who'd married children said it was standard practice for securing alliances when age gaps were significant. Said the important thing was the legal bond, not the physical relationship, which could be delayed. Your council debated for months, some advisors arguing that 7 was too young, that you should insist on an older bride, but the French were firm. Isabella was the only princess available, take her or take war, and the military advisors explained that England couldn't win a war with France right now. The treasury was depleted, the nobles were fractious, and this marriage was the only path to peace, and gradually you accepted what seemed inevitable. Told yourself that you'd marry the child legally, but wait years before making the marriage real. Wait until she was old enough to understand what was happening. The 3 years between agreement and wedding were strange, knowing that somewhere in France a little girl was being prepared to be your wife, being taught English and court etiquette and probably being told stories about you, and occasionally you received reports about her development, that she was healthy, that she was learning quickly, that she was beautiful, and these reports felt wrong because they were describing a child using the language usually applied to adult brides, evaluating a 7-year-old's suitability as a queen and eventually as a mother. The wedding day arrived in November 1396, and Isabella came to England with a massive French entourage, dozens of nobles and servants whose job was to ensure the princess was treated appropriately, to protect her, and also to verify that the marriage was completed properly, that England upheld its side of the bargain. And you stood at the altar in Westminster Abbey waiting, and when Isabella entered you saw her for the first time, tiny, 7 years old, dressed in elaborate royal wedding clothes that seemed to swallow her small frame, and she walked down the aisle holding her governess's hand, and when she reached you she had to look up to see your face, and you saw fear in her eyes, confusion, and you wanted to tell her it would be okay, but there were hundreds of witnesses and the ceremony had to proceed. The vows were spoken, hers in a child's voice barely audible, yours firm because you had to project kingly authority, and the priest pronounced you married, and the crowd cheered, and Isabella looked overwhelmed by the noise and the attention, and during the feast afterward she sat beside you at the high table and picked at her food and asked when she could see her mother, and you had to explain that her mother had returned to France, that Isabella lived in England now, that she was queen, and she started crying quietly, and the French nobles watched carefully to see how you'd respond, and you tried to comfort her gently, awkwardly, because how do you comfort a crying 7-year-old who is also your wife? That first night the ceremony of bedding was expected, the traditional ritual where the bride and groom are escorted to the bedroom by witnesses, partially undressed by attendants, and put to bed together to consummate the marriage, and you absolutely refused, said Isabella was a child and would sleep in her own chambers with her governess, and the French ambassador protested, said that consummation didn't necessarily have to happen, but the bedding ceremony was important symbolically. Proved. The marriage was real, and you held firm, said no ceremony, no witnesses, the child would be left alone, and this caused diplomatic tension immediately because the French wondered if you were rejecting their princess, if the marriage was going to be annulled on some technicality. Isabella moved into Windsor Castle and was given her own apartments, her own household staff, her own governess and tutors, and you tried to treat her like a ward, a child in your care rather than a wife, visited her apartments daily to check on her welfare but kept the visits formal and brief, and she was terribly lonely, a 7-year-old removed from everything familiar, living in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language, and she clung to her French attendants and cried often and asked repeatedly when she could go home. The palace expected you to spend time with her, to build the marital relationship, and your advisors suggested you dine with her regularly, invite her to your private chambers, begin the process of making her comfortable with intimacy, and every suggestion made you feel sick because they were suggesting you groom a child, prepare her for eventual sexual relationship, and you refused most of it, said she needed time to adjust, needed to be a child before being forced into being a wife. But the pressure was constant, courtiers whispering that you were neglecting your queen, that the marriage wouldn't produce heirs if you never spent time with her. Isabella's French attendants watched you carefully, reported back to the French court about whether the marriage was being honored, whether their princess was being treated as a queen or as an afterthought, and you had to perform enough attention to satisfy diplomatic requirements while not doing anything that felt like abuse, and this balance was impossible to maintain perfectly. There were always complaints that you were either too distant or too attentive, and you couldn't explain to anyone that you were trying to protect a child because in their framework she wasn't a child anymore. She was a queen, and queens had duties and expectations that didn't pause for age. Your own household staff treated Isabella strangely, some pitying her youth, others treating her as a full adult queen and expecting mature behavior she couldn't provide, and Isabella herself didn't understand her role, would sometimes play with dolls and toys like the child she was, and then remember she was supposed to be queen and try to act serious and royal, and watching her struggle between childhood and forced adulthood was heartbreaking, and you wanted to let her just be 7, but the institution of monarchy didn't allow it. Being queen meant constant observation, constant judgment, constant performance. 6 months into the marriage your council met to discuss the succession, and the chief advisor raised the issue everyone had been avoiding, said, "Your Majesty, the marriage remains unconsummated. This is a problem. If your Majesty should die, the marriage could be declared invalid. The alliance would be threatened." And you responded, "She's 7 years old, we'll wait." And the advisor said, "Your Majesty, perhaps when she's 10, perhaps 11, but waiting too long is dangerous. France is asking why there's no heir yet." And another advisor added, "In other kingdoms consummation happens at 8, 9 years old. This isn't unusual, this is normal." And you looked around the room and realized everyone in your council expected you to eventually have sex with this child. They were just debating the appropriate age. The discussion continued over several meetings, advisors presenting medical opinions from physicians who claimed girls could safely bear children once menstruation began, usually around 12 or 13 but sometimes earlier, and canon law set the age of consent at 12 for girls, and several advisors argued that waiting for 12 was actually progressive, generous, that many kings consummated much earlier, and they presented this as though you deserved praise for restraint, as though waiting until she was 12 to rape her was kindness rather than the minimum acceptable standard. The French sent diplomatic letters inquiring about Isabella's status, asking why no pregnancy had been announced, suggesting that perhaps the marriage should be examined to ensure it was valid, and these veiled threats meant that France suspected you weren't fulfilling your marital duties, suspected the alliance might be weakened by your failure to produce heirs, and your diplomats had to carefully explain that consummation was planned for when the queen reached appropriate age, that patience was being exercised for her welfare, but the French seemed skeptical, seemed to think this was excuse-making or rejection of their princess. Isabella herself remained mostly unaware of these discussions, continued living as a child, playing games, learning languages, being educated in history and music and dance, and sometimes you'd see her in the gardens with her governess, laughing and running, and you'd think about how these men in council were calmly discussing when it would be appropriate to end her childhood, as though this was just administrative planning rather than the calculated harm of a child. 3 years passed and Isabella turned 10 years old, and the palace physicians examined her and announced that menstruation had begun, and your advisors brought this news to council with barely concealed satisfaction, said, "Your Majesty, The queen is now physically mature, medically it's possible to complete the marriage, and you still saw her as a child, still saw her playing with toys, still saw her clinging to her governess, but the palace was saying, she's a woman now, and the pressure became unbearable. Daily hints from advisors, weekly letters from France, monthly rumors among the nobles that the king was impotent or the marriage was a sham. Isabella herself was becoming aware that something was expected. Her ladies-in-waiting began preparing her, explaining marital duties in vague terms that confused rather than enlightened her, and she asked her governess, "Why doesn't the king sleep in my chambers?" And the governess explained, "Because he's showing courtesy, but soon the marriage will become real." And you knew these conversations were happening but couldn't stop them because the entire palace apparatus was preparing her for consummation, grooming her with institutional efficiency, and you were complicit by doing nothing even though doing nothing felt like the only moral choice. The French ambassador requested private audience and delivered message from King Charles VI that France was concerned about the marriage remaining unconsummated 4 years in, that questions were being raised about England's commitment to the alliance, that perhaps it was time to consider alternative arrangements if this marriage wasn't going to produce the expected heirs, and the threat was clear: consummate or face diplomatic consequences, possibly even war, and you were trapped between harming a child and harming a kingdom. Your own nobles began grumbling, saying that a king who couldn't or wouldn't bed his wife was weak, that the succession was in danger, that if you died without heir the kingdom would fall into chaos, and some suggested bringing physicians to examine whether you were capable, whether there was physical problem preventing consummation, and the humiliation of having your manhood questioned combined with the political pressure created situation where the path of least resistance was to do what everyone expected, to treat Isabella as a wife rather than as the child she remained. You spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, knowing that refusing to consummate meant diplomatic disaster and potential war, that thousands might die if the French alliance collapsed, that your duty as king was to secure the succession and maintain peace, but also knowing that Isabella was 10 years old, that what everyone expected you to do was rape a child, that no political necessity could make that morally right, and there was no good choice, just varying degrees of wrong. You consulted with the few advisors you trusted to speak honestly, asked them if there was any alternative, any way to maintain the alliance without consummating, and they said no, that marriage without consummation wasn't really marriage in the legal and political sense, that you'd have to eventually complete the union or face its dissolution, and when you asked at what age it would be least harmful, they couldn't give clear answer, some saying 12 was canon law minimum, others saying 14 or 16 was more appropriate, but all agreeing that waiting forever was an option. You tried to talk to Isabella to gauge her understanding and readiness, though she was 10 and couldn't possibly understand what was being asked of her, and she spoke about wanting to see her mother, about missing France, about whether she was doing well as queen, and you realized she had no conception of what consummation meant, what would be required of her, and the idea of explaining it to her, of preparing her for it, felt like psychological abuse before the physical abuse even began. The pressure reached crisis point when France sent ultimatum, demanding evidence of consummation within 6 months or threatening to recall Isabella and declare the marriage void, and your council met in emergency session and unanimously recommended compliance, said the kingdom couldn't afford to lose the French alliance, said your personal reluctance couldn't outweigh national security, said it was time to do your duty as king regardless of your feelings, and they framed it as duty, as sacrifice you were making for the kingdom, as though you were the victim rather than Isabella. In historical reality, King Richard II faced exactly this situation and chose not to consummate the marriage, treated Isabella as a ward rather than a wife throughout their marriage, and faced significant political consequences for this decision, including questions about his fitness as king and his masculinity, and the marriage remained unconsummated when Richard was deposed in 1399 after 10 years of marriage, when Isabella was 11 years old, and she was sent back to France where she testified that the marriage had never been consummated, that Richard had treated her with kindness but not as a wife. This restraint was historically unusual. Most kings in similar situations did consummate marriages with child brides, and Isabella's case became notable precisely because Richard refused, whether from moral reluctance, from affection for his first wife that prevented him from accepting Isabella as replacement, or from political calculation that keeping her a virgin maintained options for annulment. But regardless of motive, the result was that Isabella was spared sexual abuse that would have been legally and socially acceptable for the time. However, many other royal marriages involved actual consummation of unions between adult men and girl children. Margaret Beaufort was married at 12 and gave birth at 13 to the future King Henry VII. nearly dying in childbirth, and her body was permanently damaged by pregnancy at such a young age, unable to have more children, and her case wasn't exceptional but representative of what happened when political marriage combined with adult male entitlement and child bride reality, when kingdoms prioritized alliances over protecting children. The practice of royal child marriage continued for centuries, with girls as young as 7 married to adult men, some marriages consummated immediately and some waiting years, depending entirely on the individual king's conscience or lack thereof, and the practice only ended as concepts of childhood developed and age of consent laws were established, and even then change came slowly, with resistance from those who argued tradition and necessity justified continuation. Child marriage in European royalty was an aberration but standard practice for securing political alliances, ensuring succession and consolidating power, and girl children were legal property transferred between families, their consent irrelevant, their welfare secondary to political necessity, and boys were sometimes also married young but far less frequently were expected to consummate immediately because male heir production wasn't as urgent, male bodies weren't needed to produce children right away, and this gender difference revealed how these marriages were fundamentally about controlling female reproduction. The practice existed across cultures, not unique to European royalty, appeared in various forms in Asia, Middle East, Africa, wherever political marriage systems prioritized alliance and succession over individual welfare, and the common thread was treating children as property, as resources to be deployed for family or kingdom benefit, and the younger the bride, the longer the family could expect to benefit from the alliance. The more heirs could potentially be produced, the more thoroughly she could be shaped to her new family's expectations. The psychological impact on the girls married this way varied. Some records suggest certain child brides adapted and even found affection within their arranged marriages, but others showed clear evidence of trauma, of women who'd been married and impregnated as children suffering lifelong physical and emotional consequences, and the cheerful narratives about royal marriages often obscured the reality of frightened children being forced into adult roles and adult beds long before they could understand what was happening to them. The practice declined not because of moral awakening but because changing political structures made it less necessary, as monarchies weakened and marriage became less critical for alliance formation, as concepts of childhood developed that recognized children as needing protection rather than as miniature adults ready for deployment, and as women slowly gained legal standing separate from fathers and husbands, but progress was frustratingly slow, with child marriage persisting in some regions. Well into the 20th century, modern historians debate how to judge historical figures like Richard II, whether his choice not to consummate deserves praise or whether he should be condemned for entering the marriage at all, whether participating in child marriage system made him complicit in abuse even if he personally avoided the worst aspects. And there are no easy answers because context matters but harm also matters, and Isabella was harmed by being removed from her family at 7 and forced into role as queen, even if she was spared sexual harm. The question of judging historical practices by modern standards remains contentious, some arguing we can't condemn people for following their era's norms, others arguing that basic harm like forcing children into marriage transcends cultural context and can be condemned across time, and perhaps the answer is both. We can understand the historical context that made child marriage seem necessary and normal while still acknowledging it harmed children and was wrong, and understanding context doesn't require excusing harm. For the kings who did consummate marriages with child brides, who impregnated 12 and 13-year-olds, who treated children as sexual partners because law and custom said they could, judgment seems clearer because harm was direct and severe. Medical records show these early pregnancies often resulted in death or permanent injury, and choosing to risk a child's life for political heir was decision made with knowledge of danger, not innocent following of customs. The practice reveals how power corrupts systems to serve itself, how political necessity becomes excuse for harming vulnerable people, how adults rationalize harm to children when that harm serves their interests, and these patterns persist today in different forms, in child marriage that continues in some regions, in exploitation of vulnerable young people by powerful adults, in systems that prioritize institutional needs over individual welfare, and understanding historical child marriage helps recognize contemporary parallels. Isabella of Valois was married at 7 years old to a 30-year-old king, lived as child queen in foreign country, and was spared sexual consummation but still suffered harm from being removed from her family, from being forced into role she couldn't understand, from growing up in system that viewed her primarily as diplomatic tool and potential heir producer. And when Richard was deposed she returned to France at 11, remarried at 13 to another adult man, and died at 19. Her short life shaped entirely by political marriages she never chose. Her story represents thousands of royal girls married as children across centuries, some treated with relative kindness like Isabella, others subjected to immediate consummation and pregnancy, all of them victims of system that prioritized political alliance over child welfare, that treated girls as transferable property rather than as humans deserving protection, and the practice continued because it served powerful interests, because kingdoms valued heirs more than they valued children, because men with authority chose to exercise that authority even when it meant harming children. The ending of widespread royal child marriage came gradually through combination of factors, changing political structures, developing concept of childhood, slowly expanding women's rights, and accumulating evidence of harm caused by early marriage and pregnancy. But progress was slow, resisted by those who defended tradition, and even today child marriage hasn't been eliminated globally, continues in regions where poverty and patriarchal culture maintain practices that harm girls. Isabella's specific outcome: married at 7, kept as child rather than treated as wife, returned to France at 11, represented best-case scenario within terrible system, and even that best case involved trauma and harm, and for every Isabella who was spared worst abuse there were many others who weren't, who were consummated and impregnated as children, who suffered and died producing heirs for kingdoms that valued their reproductive capacity more than their lives, and remembering their stories matters because the patterns that enabled their harm still exist, still require vigilance, still need to be actively resisted rather than passively accepted as inevitable.